All right, I am back. Going to finish off this text here. Took a little break. My laptop is charging very tentatively. My USB Type C charger has already been on the outs. It will only charge if it's in like a certain position. And my laptop itself is like pretty old. I'd like to get a desktop. If this would be a pretty good time to support me on Patreon. I'm gonna set up a PayPal link too, so people can just give me one-time donations. But yeah, continuing here from page 92, section 2, concluding remark and a comment on Hegel. We have seen that Hegel historicizes art, but not the concept of art. Although it has its origins in Greek art, he accords meta-historical validity to it. Zondi is correct in this observation, quote, while in Hegel everything starts to move and everything has its specific place value in historical development, the concept of art can hardly develop, for it bears the unique stamp of Greek art. End quote. Yet Hegel was perfectly aware that this concept of art was inappropriate to the works of his time, quote, if in considering them, works of art, we keep before our eyes the essential nature of works of art proper, i.e., the ideal, where the important thing is both a subject matter not inherently arbitrary and transient, but also a mode of portrayal fully in correspondence with such a subject matter, then, in the face of works of that kind, the art produces of the stage then in the face of works of that kind, the art products of the stage we are now considering must undoubtedly fall far short. End quote. We recall that for Hegel, Romantic art, which takes in the period from the Middle Ages to Hegel's time, is already the dissolution of the interpenetration of form and content which was the characteristic of classical Greek art. This dissolution is caused by the discovery of autonomous subjectivity. The principle of Romantic art is the, quote, elevation of the spirit to itself, end quote, which is the result of Christianity. Spirit no longer immerses itself in the sensuous as in classical art, but returns to itself and thus posits, quote, external reality as an exquisite, as an existence inadequate to it, end quote. Hegel sees a connection between the development of the autonomous subjectivity and the contingency of the external existence. For that reason, Romantic art is both an art of subjective inwardness and one that portrays the world of phenomena in their contingency. Quote, external appearance cannot any longer express the inner life, and if it is still called to do so, it merely has the task of proving that the external is an unsatisfying existence and must point back to the inner, to the mind and feeling as the essential element. But just for this reason, Romantic art leaves externality to go its own way, again for its part freely and independently, and in this respect allows any and every material down to flowers, trees, and the commonest household gear to enter the representation without hindrance even in its contingent natural condition. End quote. For Hegel, Romantic art is the product of the dissolution of the interpenetration of spirit and sensuousness, external appearance, characteristic of classical art. But beyond that, he conceives of a further stage where Romantic art also dissolves. This is brought about by the radicalization of the opposites of inwardness and external reality that defines Romantic art. Art disintegrates into the subjective imitation of the given, realism of detail, and subjective humor. Hegel's aesthetic theory thus leads logically to the idea of the end of art, where art is understood to be what Hegel meant by classicism, the perfect interpenetration of form and content. But outside his system, Hegel at least sketched the concept of a post-Romantic art. Using Dutch genre painting as his example, he writes that here the interest in the object turns into interest in the skill of presentation. Quote, what should enchant us is not the subject of the painting and its life-likeness, but the pure appearance, which is wholly without the sort of interest that the subject has. The one thing certain about beauty is, as it were, appearance, for its own sake, and art is mastery in the portrayal of all the secrets of this ever profounder pure appearance of external realities. End quote. What Hegel alludes to here is nothing other than what we call the developing autonomy of the aesthetic. He says expressly, quote, that the artist's subjective skill and his application of the means of artistic production are raised to the status of an objective matter in works of art, end quote. This announces the shifts of the form-content dialectic in favor of form, a development that characterizes the furthered course of art. What we deduced for post-avant-gardist art from the failure of avant-gardist intentions, the legitimate side-by-side existence of styles and forms of which none can any longer claim to be the most advanced, is already observed by Hegel with reference to the art of his time, quote, "Herewith we have arrived at the end of Romantic art, at the standpoint of most recent times, the peculiarity of which we may find in the fact that the artist's subjective skill surmounts his material and its production because he no longer dominated by the given conditions of a range of content and form already inherently determined in advance, but retains entirely within his own power and choice both the subject matter and the way of presenting it." End quote. Hegel grasps the development of art with the pair of concepts, subjectivity, external world, or spirit to sensuousness. The analysis here presented, on the other hand, is based on the crystallization of social subsystems and thus arrives at the antithesis between art and the praxis of life. That as early as the 1820s, Hegel should have been able to foresee what did not definitively occur until after the failure of the historical avant-garde movements demonstrates that speculation is a mode of cognition. The standard for any contemporary theory of aesthetics is Adorno's, whose historicalness has become recognizable. Now that the development of art has passed beyond the historical avant-garde movements, an aesthetic theory based on them, such as Adorno's, is as historical as Lukács's, which recognize only organic works as works of art. The total availability of material and forms characteristic of the post-avant-gardist art of bourgeois society will have to be investigated both for its inherent possibilities and the difficulties it creates, and this concretely by the analysis of individual works. Whether this condition of the availability of all traditions still permits an aesthetic theory at all, in the sense in which aesthetic theory existed from Kant to Adorno, is questionable, because a field must have a structure if it is to be the subject of scholarly or scientific understanding. Where the formal possibilities have become infinite, not only authentic creation, but also its scholarly analysis becomes correspondingly difficult. Adorno's notion that late capitalist society has become so irrational that it may well be that no theory can any longer plumb it applies perhaps with even greater force to post-avant-gardist art. Postscript to the second German edition. If, in spite of the intense discussion and occasional vigorous attacks that this book provoked, it appears unchanged, it is primarily because it reflects a historical constellation of problems that emerge after the events of May 1968 and the failure of the student movement in the early 70s. I shall not succumb to the temptation here to criticize the hopes of those who believed at the time, without a social basis, that they could build directly on the revolutionary experiences of Russian futurism, for example. There is all the less cause for doing so, since the hopes of those who, like myself, believed in the possibility of more democracy in all spheres of social life went unfulfilled. This also applies to the question of unrestricted scholarly and scientific debate. In what follows, I will limit myself to a discussion of some of the problems that were raised in critical reviews of the book and that have not been dealt with elsewhere. The thesis that art in bourgeois society is functionless, see end of chapter 1, section 2, has encountered justified criticism. Hans Sanders, for example, has pointed out that, quote, in sociological terms, institutions can only be structures which sustain functions for society as a whole, end quote. My formulation is in fact subject to misinterpretation. Art as an institution prevents the contents of works that press for radical change in a society, i.e., the abolition of alienation, from having any practical effect. That is not to say, of course, that art as institutionalized in bourgeois society cannot assume tasks relating to the elaboration and stabilization of the subject and have functions in that sense. A second problem raised repeatedly in discussion regards the central place aestheticism is given in the historical construct. Aestheticism is understood as the logically necessary precondition of the historical avant-garde movements, and more specifically as that moment in history where the autonomy of the institution comes to manifest itself in the contents of works. The question may be raised whether this does not mean that aestheticism is assigned an inadmissibly privileged place. In the theoretical construct, and that opposing trends such as naturalism or littérature engagée are simultaneously being neglected. Two observations are in order here. First, a distinction is to be drawn between the systematic place that aestheticism occupies in the development of art in bourgeois society on the one hand, and the evaluation of the aesthetic and political, where applicable, quality of the works of this movement on the other. It is in fact my view that aestheticism deserves a key position where what is meant by art in bourgeois society is to be understood. But this in no way entails a high estimate of the aesthetic value of the works. That both elements coincide in Adorno's theory does not mean that they necessarily belong together. It is precisely the break with art as an institution that Adorno failed to bring out in his study of the avant-garde movements. When this is done, art becomes recognizable both as an institution and as a possible object of criticism. A second aspect needs emphasis. Every theory with historical substance must arrest the development of the topic at a given point if it is to construct that development. Lukács, for example, chose Weimar classicism and the realism of Balzac and Stendhal for the historical situs of his construct. And everyone knows how this decision has affected the chances for an understanding of the literature of modernism. Although for different reasons, Jürgen Kreft also makes the level of development that literature attained in the classicism of Weimar the hub of his construct. The consequence is that he sees aestheticism and avant-garde merely as unsuccessful forms, the result of social constraints. But even the attempts to construct the development of literature and art from the perspective of naturalism or from Sartre's concept of literature engagée does not seem very promising to me, because this would mean that one would leave out of consideration all those problems that idealist aesthetics define as the distinctiveness of the aesthetic. A critical science especially cannot afford to ignore these problems. Strategies of resistance and neglect are useless here, for what has been shut out never fails to return, its vehemence increased. In this situation, Hans Sanders's proposal has prima facie plausibility. Instead of using a historical construct as a point of departure, he suggests that aestheticism and engagement be understood as a structural range of possibilities for art in bourgeois society. Yet the ease with which this concept would lend itself to use in research exacts a high price, for it would mean the end of all history of art in bourgeois society. We would be left with contingent peripheral conditions, structure of the public, overall social situation, group and class interests, which would decide, quote, what variant dominates in what form and in what historical situation, end quote. But this is an objectivist short-circuiting of the hermeneutic approach to the problem, whose aim is to illuminate the present. The critique and proposed solution of Gerhard Goebel point in a similar direction. His primary concern is to separate the autonomy status, disassociation from other institutions such as church and state, from the autonomy doctrine. Quote, literature must already have a relatively autonomous institutional status for political engagement or autonomy to be possible alternatives. End quote. It makes sense, of course, to distinguish between autonomy status and autonomy doctrine, but to separate the two is problematic. For then the concept of art as an institution shrinks to a degree where it amounts to no more than the nugatory definition of a relative independence vis-a-vis other institutions such as church and state. Relative autonomy in this sense is a characteristic of any and every institution and yields no specific criterion for the institution that is art. Differently formulated, art as an institution in a bourgeois society would be an institution without a doctrine, like a church without a dogma, or, more accurately, a church that admits all varieties of belief, autonomistic and engaged equally. This would deprive the category institution of all substance, for it would then be precisely the ideology of literature which governs the interaction with and about works of art, and which the category seeks to grasp, that would be downgraded and become a mere subordinate element. That, since Kant and Schiller's writings, aesthetic theory has been one of the autonomy of art, seems to me to speak in favor of a definition of art as an institution in developed bourgeois society that makes the normative aspects central to its reflection. This is still true in Adorno. A developed aesthetic theory of engaged art does not exist, to the best of my knowledge. It is significant that Zola's and Sartre's great manifestos should be limited to a literary genre that resisted the autonomy doctrine for a long time, namely the novel. In both cases, it can be shown that efforts toward an alternative institutionalization of literature, which is what is involved, remain indebted to the autonomy concept in essential points. Zola's wavering between a singularly prosaic view of the writer, un auteur est un ouvrier comme un autre, qui gagne sa vie par son travail, which corresponds to his effort on behalf of the institutionalization of a non-autonomous concept of literature and a conception of the writer as someone with special standing to which he characteristically resorts when he discusses aesthetic value, is illuminating in this connection. And Sartre adopts in Qu'est-ce que la littérature, a separation of poetry and prose that is anchored in the French tradition, and limits the validity of his theory of engagement to prose. Only in Brecht do we find elements of an aesthetic theory of engaged literature, but Brecht only formulated his theory when the attack of the historical avant-garde movements on the autonomy status of art had already occurred. Inferences concerning the institutionalization of art in late bourgeois society can therefore not be drawn from Brecht's theory. At most, the theory can be considered an indicator of the possibilities of engaged art after the historical avant-garde movements. The objection repeatedly raised against the preceding comments and discussion was that the institutional frame was being largely equated with aesthetic theory, and that the importance that physical institutions such as school, university, academies, museums, etc. had for the functioning of art was being underestimated as a result. The argument would be correct if aesthetic theories were the exclusive domain of philosophers, but this is no longer the case. The ideas they formulate enter the heads of producers of art and their publics by way of various mediating instrumentalities: school, especially the gymnasium, the university, literary criticism, and literary histories, to name just a few, and thus determine attitudes toward individual works. Making use of aesthetic theories is indicated because they represent prevailing ideas about art in their most developed form. It is precisely when one assumes that art is institutionalized as ideology in developed bourgeois society that its critique must engage its most developed exemplification. Far from excluding investigations into ideas of art and literature as, for example, in histories of literature or in literary criticism, it calls for them as necessary complements. The practical suggestion for research that can be drawn from the approach suggested here is that the coherence of the normative frame of production and reception, which the concept of art as institution implies, be kept in mind, and that the unrelated concurrency of accounts by individual instrumentalities, such as school literary criticism, etc., be avoided. Two kinds of criticism are situated at a different level. There are those who do not accept the failure of the avant-garde movements, more precisely, the failure of the proposed reintegration of art in the praxis of life. Others, like Burkhard Lindner, see the demand for sublation by the avant-garde as continuous with the ideology of autonomy and conclude from this that the transfer of this demand for sublation, quote, to the categorical level of art as an institution would necessarily lead to a confirmation of the traditional autonomy of art, end quote. Lindner's thesis that the demand by art for sublation is already germinally present in the doctrine of autonomy is undoubtedly interesting. Elsewhere, he quotes a Schiller text that is illuminating in this context, quote, if the extraordinary event had actually occurred that political legislation was assigned to reason, man respected and treated as an end in himself, the law installed on the throne and liberty made the foundation of the state, I would forever take leave of the muses and devote all my activity to that most splendid of all works of art, the monarchy of reason, end quote. Lindner interprets the text to mean, quote, that the constitution of an autonomy of the aesthetic is connected from the very beginning with the problem of the abolition of autonomy, end quote. But this may well be placing Schiller into too close a proximity to the avant-garde, for Schiller is not concerned with the sublation of artistic and political and social praxis, but with justifying the renunciation of political praxis and the justification of the autonomy of art as a consequence. In his argument, the separation of the two spheres is maintained, whereas what matters to the avant-garde is their interpenetration. The assumption by literary science of the avant-gardist demand that Lindner not unjustly imputes to me could occur only if that demand were transformed. Literary science cannot make it its task to integrate art in the praxis of life. It can, however, make its own the demand of the avant-garde movements insofar as the critique of art as institution is concerned. If it is correct that the forms of interaction that govern the production and commerce with works of art in bourgeois society are ideological, the patient, dialectic critique of that institutional frame becomes an important scientific task. All right. Well, there you go. Peter Bürger is a professor of French and comparative literature at the University of Bremen. He is the author of books on Corneille, French Surrealism, and the French Enlightenment, and a collection of theoretical essays. His Kritik der idealistischen Ästhetik was published in 1983. Bürger also serves as editor of the series Hefte für kritische Literaturwissenschaft, published by Surkamp Verlag. Michael Shaw has a doctorate in comparative literature from Yale University. He has translated many German works, among them Max Horkheimer's Dawn and Decline and Hans Robert Jauss's Aesthetic Experience in Literary Hermeneutics, Volume 3 in Minnesota's Theory and History of Literature series. Jochen Schuchter-Sasse, a professor of German at the University of Minnesota, is the author of books on 18th century German literature, popular literature, and literature evaluation. There's like 500 pages of notes here, which are probably very interesting. There are a lot of references that I want to get more into. There's also an index here, but like I'm always, whoa, there's a big fucking note here on Kristeva. Like some of these notes are very long, so there's like actual content contained within them. They're not just like books that are being referenced, but yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for more material on the subject of materialist aesthetics, so I'll probably go through these on my own time. I'm not going to read them out, obviously. Try to see if there's anything in particular that seems really worth checking out. Anyway, that's that. We're almost done this cycle that is related to aesthetic theory, Adorno's aesthetic theory, and he's a Bürger. There are a few like short essays that I was planning on reading just to round it out. but next week I'm going to be reading. I'm going to start something quite different because somebody supported me on Patreon. It's a friend of mine who gave me a book once upon a time that I'm going to read as a tribute, as a thank you. So, give me some money and I'll read you a fucking bedtime story. Anyway, next time.